In this Q&A video, I talk about whether there's any way out from the ideological polarisation that we're in right now, the costs and risks from climate change, whether Oxford students should have banned beef, and what would it take to persuade me that the Great Reset is a thing, and more. Let's get straight into it. Welcome to this Q&A session, lots to get to. I invited Patreon supporters to ask questions which would take priority while I would try to fit in as many others as I could. There were too many to include ultimately, so apologies to those that I don't get to. Patreon supporter Jeff asked this: in the current environment of left versus right ideological battles, are these inevitable, or are we just in a sort of global recession that we will snap out of, leading to a renewed spirit of cooperation? Thanks for the question. You're sort of inviting me to make predictions for the future, which I have no special talent for, nor indeed track record. But let's say a couple of things in relation to the current ideological battles. The question of whether they go away or not comes down to whether the tensions that underpin them are real or imagined, and whether those tensions most likely resolve themselves or actually have to be fought out. When I look back in US history, for instance, there was just as much fierce fighting and fake storytelling between the supporters of second President John Adams and third President Jefferson. Jeffersonians were totally convinced that Adams wanted to establish a monarchy in the United States like that of Britain. Adams's supporters were totally convinced Jefferson would destroy the states. They fought fiercely and told the most outrageous lies about each other. Ultimately, it passed, because the differences between them, which were real, there were real differences, but they nevertheless weren't in line with those caricatures. Obviously, you can draw a sharp distinction between that and the Civil War, which was over a difference that was real and could not structurally be resolved by just waiting for it to subside. There was a real issue that had to be won or lost. People will disagree which of those we are in today. Some will say that ultimately we're faced with significant global challenges, and moderates on both sides are able to agree on the basics while arguing fiercely over the approach to be taken, which is where you can have a framework for a blend of competition on policy with collaboration on supporting the institutions. In that version, these things pass and stabilise in due course. It would be one where the extremes on both sides that are based on unreality, the identity politics stuff on the left, the conspiracy stuff on the right, those eventually fade into the fringe and away from the mainstream. Don't get misty-eyed about the new spirit of cooperation, because it wouldn't much feel like it, because people will compete hard over different versions of how to do things, but it would be based on a stable framework. That's one possibility. The other is that we have a major gulf that can only be resolved through conflict. That could be expressed over climate change. As governments worldwide are beginning to take major transformational journeys on this, if the implementation of that falls to the extremes on the environmentalist side, whose approach to the subject is more based on faith and religion, and that would lead them to take actions that were simply outside of what a significant part of the population would accept, you could get the sort of conflict that simply won't go away until it's properly resolved. Various people in the comments will say that's where we are now. I don't think we're on the verge of eco-wars just yet. I think it's more likely to be driven by the economic dynamic of a move to new technology created by China and the EU, in which case, in due course, it will just become what everyone accepts you have to do to create jobs as one industry declines and another one rises. We'll see. It's going to be a wild ride for the next few years, whichever way it goes. And that takes us neatly to the next question. What is the truth about the cost of green energy? Or is that too simplistic a question? I fear the least well off will finish up taking the biggest burden. It is simplistic in the sense that there's no one thing called green energy. Renewables like wind and solar energy have become a lot cheaper in recent years. I saw a graph recently showing just how much cheaper these sources are now than they were just in 2008, for instance. But that said, it's not just the cost of the turbines and the solar panels, it's also the changes you have to make to the infrastructure to cope with high quantities of variable sources, both in terms of way to store excess energy when it's generated and you don't need it, either in batteries or production of hydrogen, and then the ability to use those or other sources when there's low energy. But energy's always been a mix of costs. And governments have always tolerated that because there were strategically important reasons to. So the UK government was a supporter of nuclear power back in the 1980s, partly because of the miners' strikes, which had brought down one government and tried to bring down the Thatcher government, illustrated the wisdom of having a number of reliable sources of energy, not just one. Different sources bring different benefits and risks, and having a mix means that you should be able to manage the whole better from the point of view of stability. So the government subsidised nuclear power, swallowing the fact that it was more expensive, right up until the point where it couldn't ignore anymore just how much more expensive. You're right to identify that energy costs impact the poorest hardest, because it's one of the things that will impact the quality of your life the most dramatically if it's turned off, so it becomes an unavoidable cost. This is why even Conservative governments like that in the UK will aim to subsidise the introduction of newer energy sources for the period before the push to scale naturally brings the prices down. In the meantime, in the UK, there's an energy regulator who imposes a cap on the prices that energy companies can charge. So whatever the problems there are to come, it shouldn't be the case of it simply hitting the poorest. Another one on climate action consequences from Patreon supporter David. Might be a bit difficult, but I am a UK dairy farmer, Western Britain, and began following the climate debate to try and work out how best to prepare our business for the change in weather patterns. I am planning to cope with us going from one dry year every 10 years to one in every 3, with wetter and milder winters. At a guess, how far out do you think we will be? From political prediction to climate predictions, and I note once again my lack of any specific abilities in the area of seeing the future. Obviously, given the nature of your business, you have to take exactly the sort of solid risk-based approach that you're describing here. And from the expectations we currently have, based on both what we've seen in the recent past and on modelling, it seems that your presumptions are absolutely rational in terms of the things that you need to prepare for. Certainly worth thinking about the straightforward things you can do to protect your herds from increased incidences of heat stress, which I guess could include things like planting trees that over the course of a decade will start to be able to provide more shade and measures like that. As you will know all too well, heat stress will reduce the yield of dairy cows, and even though that may only be a minor impact in the coming decade, given the precarious margins for the industry generally, you absolutely need to be planning for these things now. Most of the predictions that are made about the impacts on the industry don't factor any sort of adaptation. So when they say that heat stress related losses could reach £33 million in extreme years by 2090, that could be reduced by early and low cost investments now, and by starting to push an industry-wide interest in cattle breeding for increased heat tolerance. In the meantime, sounds like your approach is pretty solid. Good luck with it. I look forward to hearing more about how it's going. Okay, let's move on to other topics. Mallen, would you consider doing a video, the research for a video, about modern monetary theory? If its analysis and recommendations are correct, it would be good to talk about it more. If it is wishful thinking, I should stop talking about it. I occasionally do videos on topics that I think are interesting and important, but I know even before I do them that they will get low audiences. I mean, the last one I did about whether concern with climate change is in line with or contrary to traditional conservatism was exactly one of those. Personally, I think it's some of the most important content I produced, but I was never under any illusion that it would get lots of viewers. And that's a similar one to what you're proposing here. So the quick version for people who aren't familiar with it. Modern monetary theory is that if a country's in charge of its own paper currency, then there is no real downside to printing as much as the government needs for its purposes. Unlike the traditional view that sees the government like a household that needs to balance its income from tax revenues with its outgoings in terms of public expenditure, it operates as a different entity because it can create whatever money it wants so long as it controls for inflation via taxation. The short answer is I don't think it's a question I'd do a video on because it's a wholly theoretical question. Nobody's planning to adopt this as the guiding staff of their policy that I'm aware of. and most people would think it's a dull topic and therefore not want to watch it. Now, of course, that could change. People would have said the same about basic income schemes some years ago. They entered the fray when certain figures started lobbying for them in quite high-profile ways. So it can all change if awareness goes up. My gut instinct on the issue, for what it's worth, is that it smacks of the wishful thinking that a magic money tree really does exist, and I think you'd have to create real wealth, if not before you spend it, nevertheless to back up your spending. I'm open to evidence of the contrary. I would look at it with an open mind, but it's not an area I get a sense that there's much engagement on right now. Next, from Patreon supporter Tom, how much is YouTube trying to suppress you and other people questioning the orthodoxy? It may be just hearsay, or I may even be reading too much into my own personal beliefs, but I get the feeling that you would approve of an attitude that says, so investigate what is actually happening. Well, yeah, investigate what's actually happening for sure, but don't do so with any preconceptions. We know that YouTube has adopted policies around certain types of content. It has been hammered by mainstream media and other critics for types of content that might encourage harm, and that immediately opens up the question, well, then where do you draw the line and on what basis? And how would you know where they are choosing to draw the line? Obviously, we know when they take individual videos down. And we see the left-wing parties, the Democrats in the US, the Labour Party in the UK, both of them lobbying them to censor more. So, for instance, Labour said this week that they should take down all videos that might feed anti-vaxxer sentiments, which would put you on an extremely slippery slope between content that commissions harm and content that simply challenges an establishment position, whose arguments may or may not be refutable with more speech. But what about the wider question, whether certain voices are discriminated against or not? So my channel has been growing quite slowly, given the number of videos that I produce. Some have held that as evidence that YouTube is downgrading me for ideological reasons. And well, maybe. There are other possible explanations that are just as credible. We know, for instance, that social media generally rewards the more dramatic content because it gets more clicks. And so channels that go solidly after a particular tribe and the things they find most engaging is going to grow faster. Well, I don't do that. I follow the evidence. I routinely criticise all ideological tribes. So when I criticise extremist climate campaigners, that might attract people on the other side. But then in the very next video, I'm critiquing their side or talking about what the mainstream science shows. And then they get confused and wander off, some of them. And YouTube gets confused and doesn't know who to promote my videos to, because it has a category for each of the extremes. They tend to like the same things. It knows what to do with them. But people who think critically, who expose themselves to views they don't always agree with, who support the actual science, not the cherry-picked ideological version that people think is following the science, well, what category does YouTube put them into? Maybe it's not as easy. And it doesn't get easier because the algorithm gets changed regularly. And so you can see things suddenly change and you don't know whether it changed generally or if it changed targeting you specifically. So my channel was growing strongly at the beginning of the year. I noticed that climate skeptic Tony Heller's channel was also growing strongly at the same time. Then mine suddenly hit a wall, just went from one extreme to the other almost overnight. And I checked and I saw that Tony Heller's growth had similarly stalled. Some other climate related channels had not though. Now, obviously, Tony Heller fans will just assume that's YouTube going after them because conspiracy theories is kind of what he does. And they may be right, but they may not be. It could have been just one of those tweaks of the algorithm that actually shifted the visibility of independent creators versus mainstream institutional creators, for instance. We know that they have done that when it comes to news content. It's not a policy I'm wild about, but equally I'm not going to claim it's all a plot to do me down personally. Ultimately, I prefer to believe I'm in control of my destiny and overcoming obstacles is what you have to do to become successful. So first, I need to make my content as good as possible because then more people who do discover it will stay if they like what they see. Second, I need to slightly redefine how I describe what I do because I think that has evolved over the lifetime of this channel and I don't think people, when they see the branding, if you like, of the videos, quite understand what I do at a glance. Third, I need to start leveraging other platforms that can drive interest and awareness, probably principally Facebook, since its demographics closer to the one most likely to find what I do of interest. I prefer to focus on those things that are in my control, rather than the things that YouTube may or may not be doing, at least until I get some solid evidence one way or the other. I don't see it as a problem if there are factors forcing me to work hard to get better at what I do. All right. Those are all the patron questions, a couple from commenters. What are your thoughts on Oxford Student Union banning beef and pork? Been wanting to know your views for a long time, as you usually come up with other ways of thinking around topics and have certainly changed the way I approach things. Thanks. I'm delighted if what I do has stimulated your own thoughts and approaches. Don't know whether I will live up to billing on this one, we'll see. So, for those who haven't heard about this, the Oxford University Students' Union voted by a 2/3 majority to ban beef and lamb from on-campus canteens. This came as the university admitted that it had failed to meet its 2021 carbon emission goals. The motion they passed said that the banning of beef and lamb at university-catered events and outlets is a feasible and effective strategy to help the university meet its revised 2030 goal. Okay, well look, the students can vote for a ban if they want. If some of the meat-loving students hate that outcome, they could have turned up to the union, which is probably a pretty dull place to be, which is why they didn't, and voted on it. At least it wasn't just some small activist group seizing control of the union executive and pushing their policies on people. So good for them. They're making a stand. Does it actually contribute what the students are thinking that it contributes? No. Does it help that a significant portion of the students who do want to eat meat get presented with the idea that action on climate change means that other people deny you the things you want? Well, I would argue no. That is one vision of how you could go about it, but it's not one people are going to vote for. You would hope that students at a prestigious educational elite establishment like Oxford would be able to look beyond the tokenistic issues that the environmentalists get drawn to ask themselves what you would really have to do to accomplish profound change in this area. That's a rhetorical question because, of course, we haven't really seen that in universities in recent years with all the waves of cancel culture and all of that. And since this particular motion also had to tie in with this statement, banning beef and lamb is part of the university's fight against racism. Many would look at that and see purely woke gesture politics, which is fine. University politics is where that sort of thing should be. So if university facilities now lose significant numbers of customers because they don't want what they're now selling, that's a pretty good lesson delivered there to the future elite of the country. One about how easy it is to pass measures with good intentions and how often they go wrong if you haven't put in the work to properly understand the change you're trying to bring about. A learning opportunity. We all need them sometimes. Okay, next. What measures would the government have to bring in ostensibly to prevent the spread of COVID before you were forced to conclude that in fact they had ulterior motives to institute a permanent authoritarian tyranny along the lines of skeptics' worst fears of the Great Reset? Well, look, if you live in a world where the only information you have available to you is the policies that a country adopts, that might be a question you could ask. We don't live there. We live in a democracy. Firstly, we know a lot about the arguments and discussions that go on in the executive because these things are known. Even when they try to keep things secret, they leak. We know that the governing party is full of people who are watching closely and will rebel when they don't like what they see, which they just did only this week. And they didn't vote the policy down, but the pressure is on. It's quite clear further moves towards restricting freedoms will get an even larger kickback. We have the meeting minutes, the select committees that scrutinise and hold to account, the former insiders who then become critical outsiders. All of these. Not only do they mean that we know a lot about the character and the motivations of those in charge, but we also know broadly what's going on, and what we think we know aligns pretty well with what we then see happening. It's there if you care to look. Now, the premise of the question is that there's more to it than that. There's an inner cabal who have total control, plotting their masterstroke move when the authoritarian moves will be carried out, and we will be helpless to resist. To believe in that, you have to be prepared to believe in a reality that makes sense inside your head, in the absence of any supporting evidence, and in the face of a widely known reality that doesn't accord with your version. And you also have to believe in the supreme competence of the plotters, since they manage so effectively to hide their designs from everyone, save for a few YouTubers who have no evidence but made an extremely lucky guess. So, what would it take to persuade me otherwise? Quite a lot. I mean, look, there are lots of things to criticise. We certainly have some authoritarian tendencies to resist. We certainly have lots of problems to solve. None of that is made easier by jumping at shadows and mistaking relatively impotent, globalist-minded think tanks for some militarist world dictatorship in waiting. It comes down to whether you want to engage with the world as it is, in which case look to the huge body of evidence there is out there to make sense of it, or whether you want to create a myth for your recreation, essentially. And that's a lot of what does pass for politics now, to be fair, which is not a great thing. All right. Thanks to my Patreon supporters for their invaluable contribution for making this channel possible. In 2021, I'm going to be ramping up with additional streams of Patreon-only content, so I'll be seeking your feedback on all of that soon. In the meantime, thank you to all for the questions. Apologies if I wasn't able to get to yours. Maybe next time.